just make a couple of remarks. I'm seeing a lot of people who spent a lot of time in the last year plus in a lot of conversations in little boxes, and seeing people in person has been an interesting experience today, because it's like, oh, way out of context. And it's a good context to be in, seeing everybody in person and thinking back on just kind of what's the division, the Forest Resources Division, formerly known as the Private Forest Division, has gone through over the past basically 15 to 18 months of, and I'll just kind of punch through a few of them, is trying to reopen the offices, doing a reorg for the division, doubling in size thanks to the investments to a lot of the people around this table, and people online have made an effort to make that happen, so we can ensure, as from the department standpoint, that we can deliver on the programs that the public, through the efforts of the Private Forest Accord, wanted to see happening through the legislature. And there's a tall order there. A lot of people know what those conversations have been to get us here today. So seeing the culmination of all of that, and then in the background, the department's also trying to find spaces for all the new people in the same building that housed about half as many, along with the fire protection program growing. And not to mention that there were 110 rule changes in the last, developed over about 4 months. That typically that happens for one rule division, over about 2 or 3 year time period, in a lot different contexts. And then also getting the draft habitat conservation plan in place. And if you look at any organization, and in 1 year, any one of those things would have been a lot. So kudos to all of our staff who have been jumping in and trying to figure out how to get this done, working with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, the federal services, and in the new context that we're working in, to where we are today. So appreciate everybody's investment who's helped make that happen, flexibility from staff, flexibility from everybody who falls into the stakeholder category, and our partner agencies. And Terry's might be cringing right now because none of this was written down, and he prepared talking points for me. So that's all right. So just want to first off say thank you to everybody for stepping up to be part of this committee that carries forward that vision of what the Private Forest Accord authors had put together to provide the natural resource protection and keep forests healthy and productive, and good habitat for fish and wildlife, and looking for regulatory stability because of the impacts that has on all the people who live across the state in some very rural parts, and recognizing both of those. There's a tension there, and just recognizing that and looking to this group for the next 50, hopefully we've got these stickers that say 50th anniversary at the Forest Practices Act, and it was kind of given a little bit of a makeover, or a major makeover, and looking for a solid next 50 years informed by the work coming out of this committee, as you look at the rules and say, okay, yeah, it's like anything. You start out, see, are we hitting the mark on this? And now this committee has the opportunity to fine tune what those rules are that were drafted, and the statutes that came out of the Private Forest Accord, and fine tune those and ask the questions and help make sure it's informed by sound science. So I'm glad you're all here, because that sound science piece is not necessarily my background as far as getting into all the nitty gritty of that. And I know we have a lot of talent around the table to sort through those things, and the collaboration that hearing people introduce each other, and that's going to take a lot of that to get to the solutions. And it sounds like there's folks around the table who can identify the problems pretty readily, and then finding a way to move forward with that. So yeah, the engine, you might not be able to fix it, but at least we can diagnose the problem, right? And hand it off to somebody who does know, and realizing that. We're all going to be working on that. So a couple other pieces is that for the folks who are new to this or jumping in from the public or online, this committee was really born out of the Private Forest Accord to carry that vision forward, and in a collaborative and healthy way to find solutions that people from very different backgrounds and priorities can work together and keep moving forward on behalf of the state of Oregon. There's also some high expectations coming out of the governor's office, the legislature, the PAFA authors, the Private Forest Accord authors. I'll try to refrain from using acronyms, and if we can all do that as we're around the table, because it can get pretty squirrely pretty fast using all the acronyms, especially as it's an open dialogue to help the public who does join these meetings as public meetings, help them understand what is the business that's before this committee. And also the investments from ODF staff and partner agencies and members of the public who have been part of it or haven't been part of it and now want to be part of it and helping understand what the path forward is there. Now, reiterate, the adaptive management program is key to making rules that have been adopted already, and as that habitat conservation plan is developed, and the incidental take permit, and that's going to provide the regulatory stability. So this is the key component of that big picture, is everybody sitting around this table who are members of the Adaptive Management Program Committee. Also, the Board of Forestry is the primary policy making. It's the policy making body that adopts the Oregon administrative rules governing forestry, and they're relying on this committee to both develop those questions and then refer it over to, I keep hearing it referred to as FIRST, and the only fault in all of that rule drafting that we had is we didn't put forestry in front of the independent research and science so we're first and everybody knows what the priority is. And I'm not sure we can do that cleanup in the full language, but that's my preference, is that we make sure that we get this right. And that comes out of folks who are familiar with ferns and the acronyms there, but and there's going to be some challenging discussions, and taking the time to get to know each other and understand each other as we get going on this. And you're in great hands with Terry and Rebecca, Terry's the point person for the committee, and I'll actually probably be stepping out to some other things this afternoon, but this is a very important part of the board having the information they need to make sound decisions related to forestry rules in the future. One other piece that we look at is, and seeing some of the folks on the call, and you'll hear more about from some of the Private Forest Accord authors, is it's been a lot that we're coming here today, and some folks are just kind of walking into this in the first instance in a more real way, and some of the folks that are on the online and some of the folks in here have been working at this, and if they don't want to be reminded on how long they've been working at it, you can put your earmuffs on right now so you don't hear, but it's been 4 or 5 years from the ground, and some of the folks who were instrumental in getting these conversations going have stepped back and aren't part of the conversations as much anymore and kind of stepping away, and that's how much has happened, even if it wasn't all in front of all of us the whole time over the past 4 or 5 years. And I might even be cutting that part of it short because we also understand as a department how we got here. And one of the big investments that we met with some of the folks from the field yesterday is the training component and helping people know what the expectations are and how to follow the Forest Practices Act. And if people are following the rules, hopefully we're getting the outcomes that we're expecting those rules to produce, and that takes care of a lot of things. So trying to get that right on the front end and helping share the message that we don't have all of the training materials done, we don't have all of the answers on all the stuff, and we want it as quickly as you do. We also want to make sure that we get it right. So we're looking at that 50-year target. we don't start off and have a little deviation at the front end, miss the course. So staying focused, knowing what we're doing as we're getting into it, and we can have that trajectory on the right path. So I went over 5 minutes. I appreciate the time, and if there are questions, feel free to ask me now, and if there are other things that come up, feel free to reach out to me if you feel that you want to discuss any of these things further. But with that, Terry's your point person. I'll take any questions now if you want. Thanks, Nick. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick.
And I'll say thank you all for coming around the table, because I understand these are not, and we all understand these are all positions that you're stepping up to the plate for some really tough discussions that'll happen. So thank you all.
So first, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. That was helpful. And next, if you could just bring up the slide that says, the next slide should be public comment. So is there anybody from the public physically in the room or online that wants to have a moment to share public comment before we move on with the next agenda item? Not seeing anybody in the room.
I might just do add one other thing is, so, and Wendy, you might appreciate this from our time on CFF together. It's just doing a quick roll call of everybody who is a committee member for the record, and and meeting minutes will be just the video recording rather than having minutes and having staff write that up. But if you just make sure to do that at the beginning of the meetings, that would be helpful.
Sure. So why don't we do that real quick while people are thinking if they have public comment. And so we'll just go around the room to the committee members, starting over here with you, and just say your name and that you're here in person.
You just say your name and present.
Yeah.
But in person. And then if there's anybody, and the reason, so process-wise, and then if anybody's doing it remotely, they'll say Joe Smith, present by video. That'll take care of it.
All right, Amanda Sullivan-Astor, present.
Jason Robinson, present.
Casey Gula, present.
Josh Steeds, present. Will Tucker, present.
Wendy Durla, present.
Seth Barnes, present.
Julie Furman, present.
Steve Budney, present in person.
Daisy Detweiler, present.
Adam Coble, present. I'm just sure, since I was a non-voting member, if that's required or not.
And you're part of the committee still, so. And then, like I said, there's Kim, who couldn't make it today. So, looks like there's no public comments, in terms of, okay, so with that, we'll move on to the next part, which is, background. So we've got a couple of the authors in the room, one physically and one online. So there's Sean Stevens. I'm going to let Sean Stevens and Adrian Miller let you folks introduce yourselves. Come on up. And if you want to pull up their presentation, Jacob. And so they'll talk a little bit about how we got plenty more stickers here. Sean and Adrian will talk about the background of how we got to this point, and I'll let you take it from here. Sean?
Great. Thanks, Terry. My name is Sean Stevens, and I'm with Oregon Wild. I think I'm actually technically a member of this committee, but Casey is going to do a far better job than I could, and will be representing us officially at some point when the board makes that change. But thanks for having me and Adrian here today to just give a little bit of background. Adrian, maybe you want to introduce yourself up on that screen.
Yeah, I was laughing at myself because I was thinking about over the course of this process, how to attribute myself, because I started with Pope Resources, became Rayonier, and for the last 3 months, I now work for Weyerhaeuser, doing forest policy work. So 3 employers over the course of the development of this program. But I am not going to be directly participating in this, but have a lot of experience on a similar program in Washington. So I have a pretty deep appreciation for the work you all are about to embark on. And so excited to share a little enthusiasm about it.
Thanks, Adrian. Jacob, can you go to the next slide, please? So Adrian and I are speaking probably because jointly representing the Conservation and Fishing Coalition and the Timber Coalition, we were the most directly involved in designing the adaptive management process as it was envisioned in the Private Forest Accord and then carried through in rule and legislation. And Adrian just mentioned one of the reasons why he was point on that. He's been pretty involved in the Washington process. And I just baked it all along the way. So, but just, we wanted to talk a little bit about the background, how the Private Forest Accord came together, and then more specifically, how the components of the Adaptive Management Program came together. And this is probably super familiar to everyone in the room and watching, but conversations around forest management in Oregon, not short on controversy and consternation, and that was certainly the case several years ago when competing initiatives were headed towards the ballot from our various camps. And I guess next slide. And I will say that Adrian commented that I actually made him laugh with my slides here, so I expect a little bit of laughter in the room when you see those cartoons.
It makes me happy hearing him laugh on my.
But
Hey, I'm going to interrupt real quick. Folks in the virtual space aren't able to see the slides. We got the file window up, but not the actual presentation.
Thanks, Adrian. We'll get that fixed. I mean, it's a picture of Greg Miller, Bob Van Dyke, and Governor Brown. And the reason that picture is there is because rather than going to the ballot, the governor's office brought us together to have conversations about a different way to solve the problems that were out there in the forest. And that led to a memorandum of understanding between 13 conservation fishing organizations and 13 representatives, largely timber companies, but also the Oregon Small Woodlands Association. And that was announced in February of 2020. And the legislation that came from that memorandum of understanding launched a much longer negotiation that occurred really across all of 2021. Next slide, Jacob. This has the 13 original signatories from each side to the MOU. You can see, a lot of the folks in the room and a lot of folks who have been engaged in forest management conversations over many decades in Oregon. Next slide. Oh, this is animated. Okay. If you can just go.
Oh yeah.
Pop through.
I got you.
Yeah, so just the process to get to today, it wasn't until June because we had a special session in June 2020, the first special session where the original memorandum of understanding was turned into legislation. That led to those negotiations across pretty much all of 2021, week-long intense sessions in the last week of October, really culminating almost at midnight on that last night, the day before Halloween, and a final agreement. Of course, there have been several final agreements along the way because once we've figured out that we solved the problems and had the form of the negotiations complete, it was on to, how are we actually going to write this all down in a 100+ page Private Forest Accord report? David Bechtold's on the call here, and I think he said it best when he realized that winning the pie eating contest, the prize was more pie. And I've eaten more than my fair share of pie over the last few years. Luckily, after getting the report together, we were able to work with the legislature to pass the set of bills that were the Private Forest Accord legislation, and the agency did amazing work over the next several months under tight deadlines, unrealistic deadlines, to turn that into the rule package that passed in October. And the HCP process that I think Jennifer is going to talk about here in a second is ongoing and underway. And this is one of the first sort of non-regulatory steps that is called for in the private forest court, the convening of the Adaptive Management Program Committee. Next slide, please. As Nick said, it's a lot of change, and I'm holding the OFPA at 50 anniversary sticker here, which I'm definitely going to take home with me. And it is interesting thinking that the HCP that is now being designed and is called for in the private forest accord, it is a 50-year commitment for the fish species. And maybe it's just a happy accident that we are 50 years into having a Forest Practices Act, and halfway through this 100-year now long timeline, we have the most significant changes that have come for the Oregon Forest Practices Act. If that's Nick mentioned all the different rule changes. And then I think just jumping, this is really, I think, what Adrian and I want to talk about. This is from the original Memorandum of Understanding. It was our commitment to negotiate, to seek a habitat conservation plan, or changes to the Oregon Forest Practices Act that could accomplish a habitat conservation plan and an incidental take permit. But this was included as one of the original charges to create an adaptive management component that involves a rigorous look at the efficacy of existing and future forest practice regulation and a science-driven process for analyzing the need for any changes. I just wanted to underline that from the original agreement back in February 2020, adaptive management has always been a core principle that we knew we were going to be pursuing. So that, as has been discussed, the changes that we're making today are ready to evolve in a very thoughtful, science-driven way over time, and that protects both the goals of providing for the species that are included in the Habitat Conservation Plan, but also providing for certainty of how the process of change will happen for those that are regulated under the Oregon Forest Practices Act. Adrian, I've been talking a lot, but I want to make sure that you have an opportunity here, and this maybe is a good opportunity, given that some of what we did was learned from Washington, and Adrian had that experience to bring to bear.
Yeah, you've been doing a great job, and I think that in Washington State has been running I'll say similar program for just about, I think, around 20 years now, and there's some absolutely fantastic things about how that program works. But there are also some things that we've learned over the course of 20 years. And we won't dive into the specifics too much. But one of the things that Sean mentioned, certainty, and that sort of goes, not sort of, it goes both ways. Like, the regulated community needs certainty in terms of a stable regulatory system, which we believe this is. But we also, want to see certainty of change if the science supports it. And, that certainty is really what this program is about. And so a lot of the things we looked at, in terms of, I'll say variations from the program in Washington, we're really geared around making sure both parties were comfortable with the process in terms of getting sort of our mutual needs met. Natural resource policy is messy. It's complicated, and this forum really is a place where keep going on the metaphor, where the mess is going to get cleaned up, but it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Doesn't mean that there's going to always be agreement. But one of the things that I certainly learned in Washington, and certainly was reinforced during the negotiations of the Private Forest Accord, is that good natural resource outcomes, both for the regulated community and for the environment, are going to require some level of compromise. This whole agreement was based on compromise. And a big part of being able to compromise is having trust, getting to know people, getting to really authentically listen to other perspectives. I believe this very much, that if this is going to work, people really have to say, okay, I understand Sean's position. I see the problem he's trying to solve, and my job is to try to solve his problem in a way that I can go back to my bosses and say this is a fair outcome. And I think if the group approaches this with that kind of attitude, I really am excited to see what can come from this. So that's, that was my soapbox. So thank you, Sean. I'll just do all mine at once.
Well, Adrian, you can see if you've got any more soapboxing that you want to do here. We've just got a couple more slides. Jacob, if you could please go to the next one. This is the graphic on the right will show up a little bit later, and it's the schematic for how the process will work here in Oregon. The one on the left is from Washington. You can some of the similarities just in terms of the background for how we were thinking about this as it was designed. The desire to separate in Washington, it's called a policy committee, which is a stakeholder group that is about recommending policy. This body is sort of the analog for that, the Adaptive Management Program Committee. And in Washington, they separated that from the science group, which is called CEMER. Here we have the Independent Research and Science Team. In both models, the idea is to try to make the science independent from the policy discussions, which makes sense, right? We want to have the science be an honest inquiry without outside influence into what's happening out there on the landscape. And we created some different processes for how those scientific findings flow through the decision-making paradigm here in Oregon than in Washington. Some of that an effort to make sure that it wasn't overly complicated, that the science was going to be, more directly daylighted to the Board of Forestry, for example, before getting filtered by this body. And I think one key thing is, and Adrian, you can speak to this if you want, but CEMER in Washington is a stakeholder group. And the idea for the Independent Research and Science Team here is that though there are in rule and law specific seats, it's not meant to be that each stakeholder has a scientist sitting on the committee. I think some of what happened in Washington is it just became another venue for policy disagreement.
I couldn't agree more. I think that is probably, of all the changes we made, I would argue that's probably one of the most significant ones. And, really trying to create a different model on the science side of the process, so that it is attracting quality scientists. It isn't, we're not just, paying people to, put a perspective forward. I'm really hopeful that this is a place people want to come to work, not a place they're told to go work.
Thanks, Adrian. And so, yeah, I think just keeping that in mind as this entity gets started, that that you're setting the agenda with direction from the board for what the inquiry is going to be about. What do we need to look at? And then that science team is really taking it over and running from there and bringing information back to the board and back to this body for those difficult policy discussions. And, I think ideally that separation is going to exist in a different way here that allows for just good information to flow to this group as you, like I said, have difficult discussions about the policy. Next slide, thanks, Jim. And, I think what Adrian said is true, that we wanted to design something that had good bones from an infrastructure standpoint, so that this group could come together and be comfortable in knowing that you're going to be taking the best information and bringing together your interests, listening to each other, and part of the conversation today is about creating a charter about how exactly that's going to happen. But pursuing that honest task of how do we make sure, as Adrian said, that the certainty is flowing towards the environmental outcomes and towards the regulatory environment that's important for a lot of folks. And I can't believe that we've had 2 references to Vulcan today. I feel like there was like Vulcan mind stuff happening including this. But I really think an opportunity also to ask any questions of me and Adrian, since we did spend most of the time among many people developing what this program is going to look like. And it's going to take on a life of its own, but I think there's value in understanding what our thinking was as we were trying to bring it together. And before questions, Adrian, anything else you want to say?
No, that's great. I've had my piece. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question, which is about the pieces that overlap here. When we think about like the MOU and then the report that came out and then the statute and the rules. Are there parts that you, as authors of the report, see as in the report but not completely articulated in those statute and rules?
Wendy, that's a really good question, because so the report itself is referenced by the statute, so it sort of has the by extension, it has some of that power of law. But there's plenty in there that is narrative to describe rationale behind things, or here's a piece of science that helped us think about this issue. There's plenty in the report that's not in the law or the rules, and I think it's worth reading through because it does provide some context. Like I said, I don't know, it's closer to 200 pages than 100 pages, I think, but yeah, I think it's worth looking through. Off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of anything that is critical in terms of a piece of information. I think it's more the general vibe, right? Like, this is what we were trying to accomplish. These are the contours of the agreement as it was in the private forest accord. And at each stage, we had I don't know what it was, a 12-page document coming out of the October negotiations. Over several months, that turned into 100, I don't know how many pages. Stacy knows better than I do because she coalesced a lot of it for the private forest accord report. And then, a 50, 60-page primary piece of legislation. The HCP is going to be several hundred pages from that. And so each iteration has actually taken some additional thought. There were things that we didn't anticipate, or we should have anticipated, or we anticipated but we punted on entirely. And so each of them has a little bit more to it to round out the thinking and try to get more specificity around the concepts so that it's clear to people who are going to train folks on how to follow the rules, people who are going to follow the rules, the general public, so that they actually have fair expectations about what the PFA is supposed to accomplish. So that's maybe a dodge. I can't think of anything specific, but
No, but thank you.
there are those little changes throughout the whole process, and they're kind of still happening.
Yeah, I mean, I would think, sort of looking out ahead, there's things we haven't thought of yet, right? There's things we missed. There's going to be something that happens that wasn't contemplated. And this group is going to be responsible for grappling with that. It's sort of like, oh, this isn't in the book. What do I do? Well, I think the actual accord document is a good frame of reference. It may not say go left, but it'll definitely provide, I think, sufficient context for intent, and may offer some guidance in terms of what the vision would have been had that issue arisen during the course of the negotiations. So I think it's definitely good for context. 100% agree. It's great reading. But think about it also as a framework for thinking about things we haven't seen yet as you all take this forward.
Just to piggyback on something Adrian said there, as the HCP is developing, the incidental take permit is going to be for pretty much everything that the Oregon Forest Practices Act governs. And yet, the private forest accord and the new rules are aimed at a subset of those things that we deemed most pertinent or that we could get agreement on. Probably the most difficult things that this group is going to grapple with are the things that live within the OFPA that are relevant to aquatics, but were not specifically addressed as part of the private forest accord. And so they will be part of the HCP infrastructure, and they are things that are aquatic related, but there isn't going to be a specific guidepost for any of it. So that's one
Great
thing
example.
That's a different way than what Adrian stated it, but kind of the same idea.
Other questions?
I have a question. It might be more about the process, you know, that schematic that we had on the right. So
We'll get into that later, for sure.
yeah, so are you gonna be sticking around, Adrian and
I'm
Sean?
not able to, unfortunately.
Today,
Yeah,
I'll be
for the
here.
rest of the meeting?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I guess just more broadly in terms of, I mentioned off the top that Casey is representing the Conservation Coalition on this team. I'm going to be around and engaged. I mean, I think Nick might have said it, but, the folks that were part of the negotiations over all of 2021, David's on the call here, but he's not sitting around this table. There's going to be that changing of the guards in terms of who knew exactly what the conversation was, and obviously even that, there's going to be the way that I heard it versus the way someone else heard it. But I do hope to be around to provide at least my thinking on how things came together to the degree that is helpful as we move forward. Obviously, like I said, this is going to have a life of its own, especially I'm not going to be here for 50 years doing it. So, but yeah, I'm going to try to be around to provide some of that perspective when it's useful.
Great. Any other questions?
I just have one comment, and that's that I really appreciated seeing the two schematics, both from Adrian and from Sean, of how you try to learn from Washington, and kind of what the different goals are of the independent research and science team versus the adaptive management program committee. So that's helpful to me when we're sitting around here.
Yeah,
Thinking about next steps.
and there's, I had a slide up there, which was the front page of the Secretary of State's audit in Washington on the adaptive management program up there. It came out in February of 2021. I know that Adrian disputes some of the findings, and having seen Secretary of State's audits before, that they're not experts on the content matter, but so they do their best to dig in. But I think it's worth a read just to see some of the things that were highlighted that did, at least from that perspective, were problematic in the Washington program. The document's not all that long, and there's a good summary of findings if folks want to kind of lean in more to that idea of how to not repeat mistakes.
Adrian, before we lose you, I was just curious, I know we're going to talk about the initial list of research topics later, but since we have you now, I was just curious if you had any context that might be helpful for this group to hear, kind of about how that list evolved, any thoughts on sort of the key list that we're kicking off with?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the cautions we were given in the negotiation was, don't punt everything to adaptive management, right? Don't put off hard decisions to adaptive management. And that was really good advice, and we took it most of the time. But there are some particular areas of, I will say, scientific uncertainty around either the topic area, for example, amphibians is one component where there just is I'll say an absence of information to make sound policy decisions around those species. And that's an example of one where I think getting more information is a big part of us getting comfortable with the prescriptions, right? That's a big that's a, sort of one example. And then I would sort of maybe use the focus on sedimentation and roads as a slightly different category. We had a lot of debate around whether or not to have a specific performance standard for, hydrologic disconnect, if we're going to get into the weeds a little bit. And part of the resolution around that was, making sure that there's both a reporting element from landowners, that is sort of quantifying that over time, but also a focus on adaptive management, and essentially making sure that the BMPs we agreed to are functioning as they are intended in the woods. So a couple of different examples. Did that kind of extract a little bit what you were looking for?
Yeah, that's helpful context, Adrian, thanks.
Thank you, Sean and Adrian, for showing up. And I also want to say, thank you for
You won't be
showing up.
clapping in a year.
He said he won't be clapping in a year. And we'll take a break in just a moment. I want to say thanks to the authors for showing up, presenting. And also, so I worked closely with both Adrian and Sean and a few other folks, Adam, and on the actual staff management program rules. And I really appreciated the dynamic that Sean and Adrian brought to that work. And I think Adrian articulated well, and I saw it from Sean as well, of, hey, I care about this relationship, and I care about what the other one needs, and I'm going to try and solve their needs from while also respecting my perspective and my needs. And I really appreciated that working dynamic, and that sort of exemplifies how we got here, of people sitting down and conversing and figuring things out, negotiating, et cetera. And that's sort of what I'm hoping, and I think all of us are hoping, that this group will continue in new ways as well. So with that, let's take a 7-minute break. Be back at 1:45, and we'll kick off, Jennifer, with HCP. So see you in a little over 5 minutes.
Really quick, Jennifer, but while we're bringing that up, how long have you been with ODS?
I started in 2003.
In 2003, and you've been a biologist here with ODS?
Started with in the monitoring unit.
In monitoring unit?
I think I started in the staff biologist position in 2006.
I'm bad at dates.
That's
That's my
okay.
thing I'm bad at.
Mhm.
Bad at remembering dates.
Yeah.
What I really want to bring out is that Jennifer also brings a wealth of knowledge to this program, and is definitely the right person. I talked to her in depth about the program, because I didn't know anything about it. And she is so knowledgeable about HCP and really knows, is really good at bringing everyone together and bringing the project together. So I wanted to make sure everyone has confidence in her. I know we do.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Happy 20th, 2022.
Don't, you're making me feel old.
Someone else is doing that.
Well, it's
Yeah, well, with that,
pretty easy one.
so yeah, I'm serving as the Habitat Conservation Plan Coordinator, which means that I really truly do just coordinate it. I'm not, necessarily expert at it, but I'm learning very much as I go. Let's go ahead and go to the first slide. So we've already heard about the private forest accord agreement and the legislation and the new rules. And really what the HCP is it's the document that takes the agreements that were made, and it's going to translate everything, the agreements that were made, into a form that describes the benefits to the species and how they relate to the species that are being covered under the HCP, Habitat Conservation Plan. So it's a kind of a go-between document between, the state changes and the federal agencies. And the whole purpose of it is to obtain the incidental take permit. So that's one of the key pieces of the private forest accord agreement, is that we need to have, by the end of 2027, incidental take permits in hand from the federal services. If we don't meet that goal, then everything rolls back. So, no pressure. So that's the purpose. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And so as far as what the incidental take permits are, is they will provide Endangered Species Act take coverage for the covered aquatic species, which are essentially all of the listed salmonids and some that aren't listed. There's a handful of other fish species as well. And then I think it's 5 species of stream-associated amphibians. And then it'll cover incidental take when implementing the covered activities. And this is something Sean was kind of getting at earlier. And the covered activities really are forest management activities that are covered under the Forest Practices Act. The one specific exclusion that's right in the agreement is application of herbicides is not going to be something we're going to cover under incidental take permit. But really it is forestry activities covered under the Forest Practices Act. And then the last one is within the permit area. And the permit area for us is the entire state of Oregon, all private lands, forest lands, and then also counties, municipalities, and then the tribes have an option to opt in. So if any tribes opt in to the Habitat Conservation Plan, their lands would be covered. The terms for the agreement that are set are for 50 years coverage for fish and 25 for amphibians. Go ahead to the next one. I think someone's just talking. So the basics of this Habitat Conservation Plan, it's a programmatic Habitat Conservation Plan, and this is my term for it, and it's not an official term. I'm also calling it a regulatory Habitat Conservation Plan because that makes more sense in my brain. And what that means is that essentially the way this is going to work is there's a pass down of the incidental take coverage from the services to ODF down to the landowners.
Can you explain what the services are?
Yeah, sorry. The services are, thank you for that, the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is the federal agency that implements the Endangered Species Act for anadromous fish, and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the agency that implements Endangered Species Act for all terrestrial animals, and then the non-anadromous fish. And so collectively, the easy way, we refer to them as the services. And so that is the entity, it's the federal agencies that will issue the incidental take permit to Department of Forestry. ODF is essentially the group that has the agreement with the federal agencies, the services, and we hold the incidental take permit, and are responsible for administering the Habitat Conservation Plan. And the Habitat Conservation Plan is essentially administered by us through our own administration of the Forest Practices Act regulations. And so essentially, landowners receive this ESA coverage, the incidental take coverage, as a pass-through. And it's through the implementation of the Forest Practices Act and collectively compliance with the Forest Practices Act that allows us to have this pass-through mechanism. Okay, next one. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Habitat Conservation Plan development here in the next few slides. Essentially what we are doing is we are taking the agreements that were made and the content of the kind of going back or forward in time, the report, the statutes, the bills that were passed, and then the rule changes. And that is all getting written into the Habitat Conservation Plan format. And it really provides, those three pieces provide the bones of what we're working with. And the rules and all those changes are really the foundations of what's called the conservation measures, which is a key part of the Habitat Conservation Plan. And that's the part that describes what it is that you are doing for those covered species. So what is the benefit? What is the action? And it's collectively the uplift across the large land ownership across the whole state. Let's see. The other piece is the Habitat Conservation Plan. We have a chapter in there where we're going to be describing and quantifying or describing the benefits and any impacts to the covered species. That's called the effects analysis. And then lastly, the Habitat Conservation Plan as a whole has to meet the regulatory requirements of the services. And so we'll be working closely with them as we develop the plan to make sure we have it right. And probably most importantly, we are working very closely with representatives from the Private Forest Court Author Group. And there are many of you here in the room and on the phone that we're working with weekly, if not, well, I should say monthly, if not more frequently. Some of us, we meet weekly. So definitely this is a team effort, and I appreciate everybody's input on it. Go ahead and go to the next one. Okay, so as far as the Habitat Conservation Plan development, one of the things I wanted to point out, because it does pertain to the work of this group, is that in a way we're sort of reverse engineering this Habitat Conservation Plan. Usually when you do a Habitat Conservation Plan, like if you're a landowner and you want to do one, you get your scoping committee and you figure out what your covered species are going to be, what it is you're going to do for those species, and you kind of build it from the bottom up. Well, a lot of the main decision points have already been made. So that's what's in the agreement, Private Forest Accord agreement, report, statutes, and then has been changed to rules. And so essentially we are taking what was already agreed to and building around it. So it's not a traditional approach. And we are very much in the development phase. I would say we're still in the early development phases of this document. And so the Adaptive Management Committee, you guys, as well as the Compliance Monitoring Committee Group and the Mitigation Fund Committee that's being run through ODF&W are being stood up now, even while the plan is still in development. And normally those committees would be stood up more after the plan was already done. And so it's just something to keep in mind. It's not really a problem, as I see it. The HCP text, as far as the content that we're going to be writing in the chapter, which will be the Adaptive Management chapter, is really going to describe, in general, what these various committees are, the function, the structure, what it is that your goals are. A lot of this is already set forth in the PFA report, as well as the rules that were passed. So that's mostly what will be in the HCP. And so the nitty-gritty details of the work, I don't see that, as something that would be written into the HCP document. I would see that as being something that would live outside the HCP document. I hope that makes sense. Maybe we can, I can expand on that during Q&A if needed. Okay, next chapter. Okay, so as far as adaptive management, one of the pieces that's required in a habitat conservation plan is biological goals and objectives. And this, to some extent, really is sort of the connection between the HCP document and the work that you guys are going to be doing as a committee. And the two first bullets here for goals and objectives, those are straight from the HCP handbook of how the services define those. And so the goals are the broad guiding principles for the habitat conservation plan. What is it you're trying to achieve? And then the objectives is one step down for the targets that will be measured to figure out if you're achieving those goals over time. And we do have the draft habitat conservation plan that was submitted to the board in December. That's also was submitted to the services to meet our requirement in Senate Bill 1501. The author groups were responsible for BGOs and have done a great job. They put their heads together and developed those BGOs. Those are in that document, so you can go look at that. Like I said, we're early in the process. We're just starting to really kick off with our conversations with the services. They've not reviewed those. We don't have any feedback on them. But I'm not anticipating that as far as like the meat of what's there, that there will be much changes. You know, we need to go through that process. But just wanted to make sure you're aware that those are in there. And I think you're going to key those up at a future meeting, it sounded like. And so we will keep you posted if anything changes as things go. Okay, next. Okay, lastly, so for those who are on the HCP committees, you might have seen our crazy spreadsheet with all these lines and colors. I essentially took those for our schedule and condensed it to what our timeline is. The ultimate goals, I mentioned we need to have those incidental take permits by the end of 2027. So the timeline for the HCP project as a whole is kind of built backwards with that in mind. The first draft, the draft proposed HCP that's the one that was submitted to the board. It truly is a working draft if you look at that. Chapters 1 through 4 have a lot of context and text. The other chapters, 5 through 10, have a lot of placeholder language, so just be aware. We've got a lot of work to do on those. So the next draft will be what's called the administrative draft HCP. This will essentially be the second draft, where we're hoping that we will have all the chapters well fleshed out. That should be done by the end of this year. And then we're going to start off the NEPA, National Environmental Planning Act, work this year and into next year. And then
Did you say the end of this year? It says December 2024 for the completion of the draft.
So I can't stand up, so I need the microphone. So the early NEPA planning work is really truly just like getting our ducks in a row before we kick that off in earnest. So that's what's going to happen this year.
I wonder if it's one of our microphones. Got a bunch.
See all of them too, you have to.
Well, I'm wondering if it's If everyone's, can we make sure we're all muted online, please?
So what's confusing me is I thought you said that the draft, complete administration draft HCP was could be done maybe this year, instead of December 2024.
Next year. I bet next year.
Okay.
Sorry, screwing up my dates. So yes, next year. And then the public draft HCP, which is the one that officially kicks off the NEPA process, is 2025. And then we start the NEPA process, and we essentially have built in a buffer. We're planning the timeline is to get the incidental take permits issued March 2027. So that gives us a little bit of a buffer. And my next slide is just a cute picture of my dog, so, for questions. So I'm happy to answer questions. I know that was really fast and high level. No, stop.
Okay.
Are you gonna share that with really helpful timeline? I don't see it in our slides that we've gotten, if you could share it, that would be great.
Is it not in the?
It's in here. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm happy to share the more detailed one.
All right, I guess it's in here, and I just didn't find it.
Yeah.
Back on the page. So, is the HCP, would that, and the draft plan that exists right now, would that be a beneficial document just to kind of see what we're driving towards to some degree? Is that to that level yet?
I'm thinking, so the current draft does a pretty good job of laying out the basics for, just the basics that are also in the private forest accord report. I don't know that it's gonna be helpful for directing the adaptive management, your work, because that chapter in particular has a lot of work left to be done. So it'll lay out some of the basics. It would definitely not hurt to look at it. I don't think there's anything wrong in it, but there's a lot of, meat to be added back in to it. Yeah.
So I know that, aerial application is not included as a covered activity. And then the PFA negotiators, recognized that they couldn't come to an agreement on post-fire
Right.
harvesting and tethered harvesting. And
Right.
so those are allowable activities through variances and other things in the PFA right now, recognizing that rulemaking is likely to happen with, either by the time that the incidental take permit is issued or, post, but within the time frame of the 50 and 25 years length of the HCP. How are those activities going to be addressed, or what happens to obviously we can still do those activities under the Oregon Forest Practice Act. So can you just explain that process?
Sure.
Are any of those things going to be discussed in the HCP or contextualized? And then what happens, or how do those activities occur?
Yeah.
I mean, explain kind of those. Yeah.
How, you want me to tell them?
And just for folks that don't understand, if it's not covered, it's not like we can't do it.
Right, so let me start there. So, for example, the application of herbicides. So that's clearly not gonna be a covered activity. It doesn't mean that landowners can't do it. That is part of the Forest Practices Act. It just means that for that activity, if you do it and then causes take of the species, you won't be covered under the incidental take permit. It won't be part of the incidental take permit. So as far as the salvage logging and the tether logging, those are the two pieces that are keyed up for additional rulemaking. And we were just talking about this today with our contractors. The hang up there is there's a time hang up, right? So the rule development needs to get done and in a timely manner so that we can include it in the effects analysis so we can measure the effects of the covered species. That's my interpretation right now. We've not specifically asked the question of the services of, well, what happens if we can't get there? Is there some other way we can write it in and still get, incidental take coverage? So that's the hang up, is can we get it done in time to include it in our process and not cause the whole thing? We have a drop dead deadline that we have to meet.
Yeah.
So that's where the crunch is. if the rulemaking is done, or at least hopefully far enough along that we can include it in the analysis, then we just roll it in, and then the document will be modified before it goes to the public draft. So that's what I understand, one of the hard deadlines is that once we start the NEPA process, there's not a lot of wiggle room to change what's in the Habitat Conservation Plan document as far as like parameters. So that's one of the other deadlines we're working with. So if we get it in, fine, we're great. It'll just be part of the HCP. If it's not done in time, then there's gonna be a little bit of figuring out a plan B. Worst case scenario is if it just doesn't get in the HCP, then the rulemaking will still go forward. It will be just like the herbicide. It'll be covered under the Forest Practices Act, but not under incidental take permit.
Or you cover the standard practice, this is more of a discussion than that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming when you're talking about that, you're talking about both the salvage piece and the tether.
Yeah.
Salvage, of course, the date is much sooner than tether.
Right.
You just have to start by a certain date. and
Yeah.
Right.
That could be,
Yeah.
other trajectory.
So some of it may depend on the outcome of the rulemaking.
Right.
If the outcome is that it's what you're doing is similar to what's already in
Right.
our
Yeah.
overarching rules, that kind of framework. If it's something completely new, I think that's where it gets.
I guess I was more talking about the tether logging. That one has a higher likelihood of not getting done in a timely manner to be included in
Yeah.
That's like, this is more of a discussion for that group.
Yeah.
Certainly, one of the potential outcomes could be covering standard practice and then recognizing that might, be modified at some point because of a future rulemaking.
Yeah. So we have not, with our HCP group, really hit this head on yet.
Okay.
So I am speaking a little bit, kind of out on a limb just a little bit, but it's definitely something we've got to address and figure out time-wise. But I don't have a firm answer for you, but it kind of gives you the ballpark.
Yeah, okay.
John?
I just wanted to mention that on both of those rulemaking, the SB 1501 directs that the board does not have to and process for them, but
Yeah.
it can. I think the timelines are going to be prohibitive for the post-fire conversation, or post-service conversation to happen in this body, but who knows?
Yeah.
I wanted to mention.
Then I have a question, Jennifer, could you return us to your, maybe to the slide, if you could, Jacob, on, the biological goals and opinions, the draft, down at the bottom.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, so the last bullet point, there on
Yeah.
draft, biological goals and objectives, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like they're pretty far off.
What's pretty far off?
Just, the draft BGOs, you don't think that they're gonna change significantly?
I think that what we have is a really good, solid, framework for the goals and the objectives. So what we need to talk about in the HCP group is, well, first of all, we do need the services input, right? Because they're the ultimate decision makers.
Yeah.
So that's first thing. I want to wait and see what they have to say. The second thing is, we may need to take what's there now and, again, add a little meat to it as far as the measurable piece. That's the other thing that, as far as our internal team and the consultants, that we think may need some more work.
And then the second question, thank you, the second question, how do you see the biological goals and objectives, the language of them, tying to, the work of the adaptive management?
No, thank you for asking that. I meant to bring that up.
That would bring it back to your,
Yeah, no, that's actually perfect, because I forgot to mention that. So the BGOs, I wish I had had an example in here, but, they really are setting the framework of what the objectives are for the species. And so as far as the work of this group, and then also teeing off to the IRST, I'm not gonna say what that is, because I'll get it wrong, but the science group, it's really about the effectiveness monitoring piece, right? So that's where, this is really the connection between the overall goals, what it is that we're trying to achieve by the rules and also the HCP. And so the BGOs really set the framework to help you flush out what it is that needs to be monitored to track the effectiveness. That's the whole purpose, is what is are we meeting our goals? And is the HCP, are the standards that we have set forth effective? The compliance stuff is totally separate from this group.
We'll get into that more
Yeah.
momentarily. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Other questions on the HCP? Great.
I have one just quick question. So, you know, because the department is pursuing another HCP on state
Yeah.
lands, and we've run into some issues on timelines from the services on the EIS, because of staffing shortages. You know, obviously, we really can't run into
Yeah.
some of those same timeline shortage, issues with this timeline in relation to when the ITP, the incidental take permit is, the deadline is. So do we have, I mean, I'm sure we do, but do we have commitments from the services that, you know, this is going to be a priority? Like, and how are they gonna work through their workload to
Yeah.
ensure that their part related to the NEPA and the EIS, the environmental impact statement, are gonna be met with it? I mean, 'cause it's a
Yeah.
pretty short timeline.
No, that's fair, and it's too bad Kim, couldn't be here today to speak, you know, for himself, for the agencies. I will say, you know, both agencies were, you know, in the room, they're not signatory to the agreement. You know, I've heard verbally that there's a strong commitment. Internally, we are working with specifically NIMS, because that's where the biggest staffing issue is, to help get them some support to help us move this along. But I think they're very well aware of the timeline, and I feel confident that maybe
And I assume it's just gonna be a no action and an action alternative, you know, the action alternative being the state.
gotten that far in my,
agency.
I'm sort of, I think things linearly, is how I progress the project, too far.
Yeah, well, 'cause I mean, I don't know, 'cause like you said, it's more of a regulatory HCP. It's not really like a typical HCP.
Right.
We already have it sort of done, and it was negotiated, so it's not like there can really be an alternative,
Well,
you
we
know?
do have to have alternatives described in the HCP, and we'll get to that here pretty soon. But they're not gonna be like, my understanding is the way they get formed, is it's not like some other drastic alternative, right? So one of the alternatives will be the original FPA, right? That's an obvious one. Some of the other alternatives that often get put forward would be like different permit time periods, is another example I've heard.
Yeah, well, and
But there's
typically you
not
only
gonna be
just need an
anything
action and
drastic.
a no action, but
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah. All right, I'll be sticking around for a while if anybody has any questions you can hit me during the break. Great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. That was wonderful.
Jennifer.
We talked for Jennifer too.
Yeah, we can talk for Jennifer.
Sorry, Jennifer.
You could go past the break one, next one.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Did my job. That's it. Keep it.
Okay, so we're gonna keep on rolling here and get a little bit more into what adaptive management program is and how you folks fit into it and how it's all gonna function. So, bring up the next slide. And I'm gonna read directly from rule, says the policy of the state of Oregon, the regulation of forest practices for the protection of aquatic species shall, in addition to other statutory requirements, be subject to a process of adaptive management, whereby forest practices rules are monitored for effectiveness relative to biological goals and objectives we just heard about, and modified if necessary to achieve the biological goals and objectives. So that's the big picture that you've heard phrased in different formats from the authors, from Jennifer here, but that's sort of the big picture policy statement of adaptive management. Any questions or comments or thoughts on that?
I'm trying to think about how this all, like, dovetails, because that doesn't specifically say biological goals under the HCP or a court. So I'm wondering if the adaptive management program is just part of the statute generally, or is a subpart that's effectively, ruling this committee?
I'm not sure I'm following your question. The biological goals and objectives are, it is a defined term within the rules,
Uh-huh.
and it is linked back to the HCC.
Okay, that was
So-
the key question.
So there will be a consistent, chunk that's the biological goals and
Okay, got it,
objectives
yeah.
that,
We've got someone on the statute here.
cool.
Yeah.
So, next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Next slide after that. Yeah, now we're good. So, the program purpose, as again stated in rule, to ensure timely and effective change as needed to meet the biological goals and objectives, provide predictability and stability in the process of changing regulations, so landowners, regulators, interested members of the public can understand and anticipate change, apply the best available science to decision-making, and effectively meet biological objectives with less operationally expensive prescriptions when feasible. So that's what the purpose of the adaptive management program is, as stated in rule. And we'll get into how that's all gonna function and everything a little bit later, but any questions at this stage of the game on what the purpose is? I think that's it. Oh, cool. We'll keep on rolling. See the next slide.
Hey, I have one quick
Sure.
question. So, I've been really intrigued by this idea of, if we can meet BGOs with less expensive prescriptions, and depending on what we find in the scientific research that's done, we should do that. I've been thinking about the science side and our work from more like biological side, but as we think about expensiveness of treatments, obviously there's economics with that too. So is that something that we're going to be discussing, and we can get, further obviously into that conversation as far as who is the right types of researchers on the science team, but I guess I've been thinking about it really from the biological side, not
Sure.
really the economic side, but,
Sure.
but there is a piece there.
And so that's a really interesting question, and the independent research and science team that we'll talk about soon,
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing about economics on that team. However, in rule, there is something, 0100 sub 7 talks about adaptive management research program research may test whether operationally less expensive prescriptions can effectively meet BGOs, or more risk-averse prescriptions are necessary to meet BGOs. So that's one link to it, and then in 0200.
I think with the flow chart too, you talk about that.
Yeah, it's a little funky to fit into that flow chart,
Yeah.
but there is a thing in here that AMC may request the department to hire a third party to complete analyses that address that question.
Okay.
So that can fit into this. It's a little bit, it doesn't quite fit in with the structure of exactly how everything in terms of the IRST, but there is still a mechanism to have that considered and addressed through some type of analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Make sense? Okay, so just real quick, that's the management participants. If you could, maybe actually, if you go to the top and you hit that, the next one up, that one, I think it'll put all in one. Yeah, there we are. And it's kind of out of the way. Thank you. So this is sort of the main folks that are going to be participating in adaptive management. So there's y'all in this room. There's independent research and science team, or IRS team. I don't know, that doesn't sound too appealing. But IRST, or independent research and science team. IRST housing agency, which we'll get into more later, but it's starting out with Oregon State University's Institute for Natural Resources, and I'll turn to folks here in a moment that are in the room to introduce themselves from them. And then there's the Adaptive Management Program Coordinator, which is myself, but really it's me with a whole bunch of other folks helping out, Rebecca, Nick, conversing with Adam, Jacob, et cetera. So I'm just sort of easy person to point to when things go wrong. Oh, wait, did I say that?
You're the one with the answers.
Oh, that's right, I have all the answers, exactly. So I will just real quick say that we're in conversation with the Institute for Natural Resources about what it looks like for them to support the independent research and science team. There's a lot of detail that we won't get to today. There's a little more detail we'll talk about momentarily. But I want to just say hello to folks that are in the room, which includes Sean Gordon back here. If you want to just introduce yourself briefly, and then I think Lisa Gaines might be here as well. So go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, hi folks. I'm Sean Gordon, with the Institute for Natural Resources, and we're a state chartered institute that's at Oregon State and Portland State Universities. And our mission is basically supplying scientific information to the public and state agencies. So it seems like a good fit for this process, and I'm really excited to join you folks in it. Look forward to figuring it all out.
Exactly. Thank you, Sean. And then Lisa Gaines, are you still here?
Yes, hi. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I am tapping into this meeting very briefly because I'm also on the Oregon Geospatial Information Council, and our meeting coincides hour for hour with this one. But my name is Lisa Gaines. I direct the Institute for Natural Resources at Oregon State University and at Portland State University. And we are really happy to be able to find our role in working with you all in establishing how we can house the IRST, how we can work on those processes to make this as useful and as implementable as possible. And we have done such work before with other groups, and hope that we will find a way to continue our path with working with you all. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Lisa and Sean, for introducing yourselves. And ODF will be conversing with you, and we'll be keeping this group in the loop of how that all evolves. And stay tuned there. More details to come.
Super. May I say one more thing really quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
And this is about, I saw the slides in advance, and I don't know if you did this on purpose, but the page you have the IRST and the INR on, you have a skull, which is a rowing skull. And if you want to know one of the things I'm good at, that is it. It's rowing. So one of the many things I'm bad at, there are a lot of many things I'm bad at, but I'll get to that when I get to meet you in person.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
You had it confused for a second.
Yeah. We all skull and crossbones, and then,
And I was like, we did something wrong.
Oh, wonderful, thank you, Lisa. So, real quick, these are all the groups that's quote unquote in the room. The services folks, Kim couldn't make it. Kim with NIPS couldn't make it, and Fish and Wildlife said, we don't have the person power right now to be in the room, but we're going to pay attention and we'll step in as needed. And then these last three are non-voting. And this is all set in statute. And there's a mechanism if one of these groups should evaporate, disappear, there's a mechanism to bring a substitute group in. So no need to cover that more right now.
Can I ask a question before you get off this? So super happy, Adam, that you're here. I'm guessing, so you said you're the ex officio actually sitting on the committee, right, for ODF?
Yeah.
That's good to know. And you're compliance monitoring now, right?
Yes.
And so one of the questions I had, and maybe this is for later down the road, is how do those two things intersect? Compliance monitoring and adaptive management. I would assume there's at least a touch point between the two. There's a compliance monitoring audit or something like that, and maybe that's for, like I said, down the road discussion. But I'm interested in the perspective ODF has on how that link happens.
Yeah, I can address that. So, both monitoring, compliance monitoring, and adaptive management, in terms of what's required for the incidental take permit and the HCP, those are both requirements. In terms of touch points, there is actually something in statute, and Terry and I were discussing that there is, I don't know how it's worded, but compliance monitoring reports are reviewed by, I can't recall if it's independent.
Well, we'll get to that in the next slide.
Okay, yeah, so that's one touch point there. And we're still kind of discussing how we'll handle that. I don't know, Terry, if you have any other thoughts on touch.
Not to add right now.
Okay, all right.
Yep. Cool, thank you. Next slide, please. And I'm gonna read directly from, the statute, Senate Bill 1501. So the Adaptive Management Program Committee shall guide the adaptive management process, set the research agenda of IRST, and recommend to the board the team's budget, assess the scientific findings in a report prepared by IRC, and then you all folks will prepare a report based on that goes to the board and identifies alternative actions, including no action, to address resource issues identified in the IRC's reports, and then submit the committee's, your reports to the board. The A through D, we're going to talk about in more detail soon. So just put a pin in that. So you also assist the board in the ongoing process of identifying and modifying resource objectives. And this is a little challenging in the sense that we don't want to have moving targets. And so technically we could be changing the resource objectives, but in terms of the biological goals and objectives as a term of art in the HCP, those can change, but would take a huge effort. Because as I understand it, and Jennifer might correct me if I'm incorrect about this, or Kim Kratz if you were in the room, but to amend the biological goals and objectives in an approved HCP would require reopening it or amending it. That would mean it would go back out for public comment. There'd have to be a new biological opinion and the whole NEPA process. And so it's feasible, but it's also not designed to be easy because it's a, the services put their stamp of approval on a set of goals and objectives that, hey, this is what we want you to meet. And so if there's changes to what that is, it's not an easy process. Review reports related to compliance, monitoring, and enforcement. So that is in statute. We didn't talk about it in drafting the adaptive management program rules because it's not in adaptive management. So that's something that internally we're figuring out, and as we talk about it, as we learn about it, we'll keep this group in the loop and make sure that that's working well together. Submit recommendations to the board concerning rule adjustment, guidance, or training. So again, this is not something that we talked about in drafting the adaptive management program rules in much detail in terms of compliance or guidance or training aspects of it. And then strive for full consensus in committee decision-making with a big asterisk that says, but the supermajority is required on significant decisions. So one of your first decisions, the next meeting or two, will be deciding what a significant decision is.
And that will be significant.
I know. I know.
I'm sure we will. We'll have to do it.
So any thoughts, questions about this charge as laid out in statute? Josh?
So a thought on the compliance monitoring, if we have, monitoring from the physical environment, fish population responses, water quality responses, et cetera, that indicate an issue, we need to know, is that because the rules are being followed and the rules themselves need to be more risk averse, or is that because the rules are not being followed and we've got a compliance issue? So I think that's what leaps out to me immediately on the compliance monitoring, is we need to be able to disentangle whether it's a education and enforcement issue or whether it's an issue with the rules itself, and having robust compliance monitoring is going to be key for that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yep. And certainly the compliance, just to piggyback on that, there is the whole statute and then rules have a pretty robust description of compliance monitoring. We're not going to go into those details here, but does have a pretty solid design for being rigorous in terms of having external stats review, et cetera, to make sure that that's a really solid program, and fortunately it's in good hands with Adam and other folks to do that work.
Yeah, and just one thing to add to that, our compliance monitoring in the HCP, if you look at the conservation measures, which I think part of are underneath the biological goals and objectives, our monitoring is gonna align really well with those conservation measures, which is essentially the FPA rules, right, Jennifer? The conservation measures are essentially describe the rules.
For the most part, the rules
Yeah,
form
so,
the basis for the conservation measures.
yeah, and that'll be, really focused on roads, stream side buffers, and then harvesting on steep slopes. That's sort of the priority for the compliance monitoring.
Cool. All right, next slide, please. So in terms of, kind of how you will function, again, more details later, but the big picture is you folks will be developing a charter starting probably at the next meeting. These meetings are by statute public meetings, and they will be recorded and put online. So if you happen to miss a meeting, you can go back and see what the conversation was. Membership, it's 4-year terms, with unlimited renewals, and the terms are staggered, so everyone has a different, for your first term, there's different end dates, but there's opportunity for continuation there. Vacancies, the board will decide based on 2 nominees from any particular group, when there is a vacancy. We also built in an interim status, since we recognize things happen and people might not be there. So we want to make sure that each group had continuous representation. That was really important. And so we built that in, and one example is, as we were getting the nominees from the groups, LCIs, it took them longer to come to a decision, and then Oregon Wild's group, Sean stepped up and said, I'll be the nominee, but I'm a placeholder because we're hiring somebody to do this. And so technically you're I think interim, but in reality you're the full-time people, full-time reps.
I get to vote. I said I get to vote.
Yeah, exactly. And then this last one is a key thing, decision-making authority. We're going to do our best to tee up this, significant decisions ahead of time, so you have a chance to converse with your respective groups. And so, it's important that we're clear on your authority. When you walk in, what is your authority? Within a meeting, there's going to be a vote. What is your respective authorities to make that vote versus, we negotiated, things changed, I need to go back to my group. And that just presents a challenge that we're going to have to figure out if that were to be the case, because then timelines get pushed back. And so I'm just kind of curious to hear from folks about what your respective authorities. It's not like we're going to push in, hey, surprise, today we're voting on this thing, but hey, next time you will be voting on this, and hopefully you've had a chance to explore the parameter space of how the decisions might get formed up. I mean, generally that'll be formed, but there'll be conversations you folks will do in the room. So I'm just curious to hear. Go ahead.
So part of my background is a misspent youth in the military, and as a non-commissioned officer leading groups, the first general order for both the Army and the Navy and the Marine Corps was to take charge of this and all government activities in view. So you weren't just in charge of taking that piece, you were to do things. And I've taken that into my life as an elected official. We have to sometimes make a decision, and being that boot on the ground means we need to do that. Having said that, we can't do that without respecting who we represent.
And so I fully expect to be asking my fellow electeds, their thoughts and opinions about topics. I fully expect to reach out to the local timber industries that are in my community, but ultimately, someone has to make decisions, and I am frustrated, I'm impatient, as I have mentioned. I am frustrated when decisions can't be made. Even sometimes I'd rather have a wrong decision made that I correct mid-course than have no decision made and have us wait. And my career was Hewlett Packard, and I was not an engineer. I was a sales guy at the end, managed factories in between. But having people not move because of paralysis analysis, they would just want one more set of data, one more research, one more market study, one more, and the answer was, we need to decide. We've now lost that market. Someone else has now stepped in. So I really do see that this body needs to be ready to if we are going to meet the deadlines that are in here, especially our first ones, we've got to make decisions soon and be rolling forward. So I'm really supportive of making sure that we feel like we have that authority, but know who our authority comes from and have a tie back to that, who that authority comes from, that we are reporting, we are connected.
It seems to, also I appreciate that, and that seems to connect to the timeframes that are, you and I, Wendy, discussed this recently, that are either in rule or in the accord, which is that it says at some point you're just going to need to, the AMC is going to need to make set timeframes so that decisions are made without wasting time, without calcifying, I think is the term.
I think part of that will be in your charter as well. In your charter, you can definitely say that in the charter, on the agendas, we will have, what will be voted on. And so at that time, then you will have to either abstain from voting or vote.
Yeah.
So that'll be part of the charter as well.
I think that's gonna be an important part, having those timelines and having things teed up, especially as I'm representing LCIS, getting back to all the tribes, getting information input's gonna take some time, as we know, just getting on this board took some time. So that's gonna be helpful. But I agree, at some point, there's a decision to be made,
Yeah. Might be useful, I mean, we might think about this as maybe that's not needed to be on a charter, but to the extent that there's a difficult or controversial discussion to be had, and we're in a meeting, more down the road, where things are changing even in that meeting in terms of where we might be. I mean, sometimes it's very useful to have a recess where people have a chance to call and talk with a few people or convene something before you come back together, so it's not like, you have to kick the can down the road for days or weeks. It might just be, we need 10 minutes here for discussion. If people have anything they need to check in with. I know that's necessary.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. That's all for that time frame to converse. Other thoughts or questions about that authority from your respective groups to make decisions of what your fellow committee members have already said?
I think one thing that's a segue from what you said is that, also we're often gonna have to be making decisions without perfect information, and so, individually and as a group, getting comfortable with the fact that there's gonna be some degree of uncertainty in many of the spaces that we're making decisions.
Yep. Okay, let's go on to the next slide here. So now we'll talk a little bit about the independent research and science team, and this is all in statute, but basically there needs to be an odd number of members, at least 5, one each from 3 different groups: public institution, timber industry, and a freshwater aquatic conservation non-governmental organization. The members must be subject matter experts and have an advanced degree in relevant natural resources, such as forestry, ecology, and fisheries. So that's sort of who makes up this group, and this is really important because you folks are going to nominate who's on that team. And that list of nominees will go to the board for formal approval we're aiming to have that in June. We'll get to soon we'll get to working on some of that. I mean, literally 20 minutes from now, we'll start talking about, you will start talking about what that looks like. But the big homework for today to leave with is going out and talking with people who would be prospective members, potential members on that committee, on that team. Next slide, please. So their charge is to conduct and oversee the research requested by you folks. We'll get into the details of what that looks like, but in the big picture, that's they're sort of supported by INR is the vision, and they're not on the ground doing the research. They're sort of a body that oversees putting out requests for proposals, managing the contracts. So you could almost think of them as a board of directors with INR staff helping to implement that direction in terms of doing things like putting out RFPs, managing contracts, et cetera. So that's a way to conceptualize their work. And then at the end of the work, there needs to be a report that comes to both you and the board. So that they'll probably do, whoever does that research work will do a technical document report, but there also needs to be a lay person, a report designed for lay folk, including, some of you are experts in science and some of them are, some of you aren't, but they'll go to you and the board. And so these bullet points describe the elements. So it's effectiveness, in the studies examining alternative prescriptions, and this is all described in rule as well. So that 0206 sub G gives those details. And so this layperson report is really designed to help you understand what science was done, how it was done, and what the results mean from in lay terms. And so things like causal links, assessment of how the results are relevant, new research findings, clarify causal links, magnitude of impact, which is assessment of the magnitude of uncovered species or BGO, biological goals and objectives on a sliding scale, time scale of effects observed, immediacy of likely changes, and scope of inference, how much geographic inference can be made from this, scientific uncertainty versus confidence. So these are all things described in this rule here that need to go into this report that comes out of the IRS Research and Science. So that's sort of the high level. Any questions about that charge? Go ahead.
Yeah, so this might be a good time for me to bring up the question that I had earlier. When we heard from Sean and Adrian, the idea was that the IRST would sort of be, or as much as we can, not be a political mechanism, right? Sure. And this is really the stakeholder kind of political body. So when I think about science and the scientific papers that I read, right, I always look at the methodology and the results first, right, the data, before I read the discussion, because the discussion is most often an opinion section. And so, there's always going to be opinion. We're people, right? We have opinions. And so with this report, it seems like we're starting to get into that opinion, or trying to have the IRST contextualize from their point of view the results. So I guess I am starting to get a little bit concerned about, is the IRST's goal just to report on the results to the board, or are they really going to be contextualizing that? Because it seems to me like it should just be about the results, and this body should be the one that's trying to contextualize that information.
Right. So that's a good point. And there is
And that's why I thought maybe Sean, if Sean had an opinion about that, or if you guys discussed that in these specific concepts in the report.
Yeah, and I'll take a first stab and let Sean and Adam jump in, but the challenge is that if they just turned over a highly technical document that had, here's the method, here's the results, without anything, probably half the people in this room their eyes would glaze over. So the idea is that they're an independent body of people that can provide it. Admittedly, there's some interpretation of those results into what does this mean, but that what does this mean is still supposed to be limited to what does the science mean, not what should we do from a policy perspective. What we should do from a policy perspective is for you folks to pontificate on and communicate to the board.
Mm-hmm.
So, Sean, Adam.
Yeah, and I think I see discussion as interpretation of results staying within kind of the scope of the question or the work. And I think Terry's right, and it would be good to have their interpretation of the results. But, you know, scientific writing, there's always striking that balance between what do the results say, what are the implications without going too far beyond your results. So,
and recognizing the assumptions and the box that you have to be put in, because the scientific method requires you to have controls that are not often the reality that we live in the forest and natural resource environment, right?
Right, yeah. So I think getting their interpretation would be important, and then to help inform policy decisions. But if they're not doing their job, then they, you know, could very well go beyond what's been sort of with the study. So
Fine line is a fair caution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I think it's good for us to recognize that part of our charge, or what I think is part of my charge, is to take that information and contextualize it, right, for the board as we think about policy changes and recommendations. Because, yeah, I mean, that's why there's so much controversy in the scientific community, because it's interpretation, right? It's statistics, and then it's contextualizing that information on, okay, now what do we do about that? Or they didn't consider this, or, you know, all those other things. So, anyways, I just heads up, I guess, for all of us as we move into this space and be thinking about the people that we want to nominate and who have we seen be more, you know, maybe on one side of the spectrum in relation to how they promote the science that they've done versus kind of the other aspects. So
I was gonna kind of take a different take on this a little bit. It's just one that has had to take a lot of scientific papers and transform them into engineering applications. The thing that often escapes people is the last bullet item. That is the degree of confidence, you know, whether that's standard error or level of level of confidence interval, that sort of thing. And so if statistics for a lot of folks is something that they don't typically deal with. And so I would hope that whether it's these folks in the IRST that somebody can translate those statistics, which are often arcane, into something that people can understand, you know, that they can relate to, some sort of analogy or whatever it is, or that we as a body are brought up to a certain level so that those people that don't deal with those kinds of statistics can better appreciate what they are, because that could make a big difference as far as what decisions you make, because how much confidence can you place in a particular finding. So,
Right.
Or maybe even the thought around, I think I said this, who is on that IRST? I mean, we might think about having somebody on that IRST that's got some statistics.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that's what it's boiling down to these days, and so I think it's important for everybody to be fair to themselves, to understand where their limitations are. If they're not clear of what does this really mean? You know, how much confidence can I place in this answer?
Yeah, just to add on to that, I'm glad you flagged that last one, Dave. I think that's a really important one, and we spent a lot of time in trying to think of this, kind of crafting this list of what are the things that would be in this report and focus, to then be able to do the work of this committee, thinking about what are the policy options, what is the range of the
as well with, that Terry gets tasked with, is helping them with their charter. And so, and maybe, OSU too. I would imagine that might be one of their tasks, and part of their charter would, I would hope, would be quality control checks. And that would, of course, determine, that what they're doing has confidence and certainty.
And that is, well,
Yes.
never mind, I'll get that. Any more here before we move on?
The way that I'm here, sorry, we'll just keep pounding it, and then we'll all be really clear. So the way I'm hearing both your presentation and, how report, statute, and rule have laid out the differences between the Adaptive Management Program Committee charge, the independent review, research and science team, and the scientists whose work they will commission. And so I'm just like laying this out in what I hope is language that you can say, yes, that's what we intend, is that the scientist does the science based upon our research agenda, based upon report, statute, and rule, that gets translated into technical language by the independent research and science team with the help of INR. That gets commissioned, the research gets done, it's submitted in the form that the scientist who does the research, the way that she thinks is the appropriate way to do it, and is presented to the independent research and science team. I'm working really hard to not have acronyms. And then they produce the report based upon, that is the science of effectiveness, causal links, magnitude of effects, time scale, scope of inference, degree of scientific confidence or uncertainty, that comes to us and to the board for the policy recommendations, whether they be rule, statute, or plan, right? Yep. So it's a discrete, like, science, making the science understandable to us, and then us taking that science and proposing policy in various alternative forms to perhaps, as Amanda noted, with an economic weigh-in, right, at some point too. Which seems like a great way to do it, that option. Yep. Am I hearing it correctly?
I would say you're 98% of the way there.
Okay, sweet.
That was a.
I thought it was 97, so.
That was a really good, overview and way to frame it. One super duper small nuance that almost doesn't matter is that this lay report, it's gonna be up to the INR and the IRS team whether they produce it or whether the contractor produces it.
Got it.
It could be either one. Ultimately, I think it's gonna happen. It's gonna come in a way that you folks and the public and the board can go, oh, this is what the science findings are. To hit all these bullets.
Super helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Let's go on to the next slide. So, we talked about that IRT supported by INR, and then, we'll work with IRT through me and through INR. I think we kind of hit on that at the next slide.
And that's the school, right?
Yeah, that's the school she was talking about. Right, that I pictured skull and crossbones, and fortunately something better than that. I thought, my goodness, did we do that?
I missed that in our reviews, how many times?
Participation grants. The idea, so this is laid out in statute that this is a possibility. And the short story is that everyone on this committee, except for a few unlucky folks, are eligible. Those ones that are not eligible are ODS, DEQ, ODSW, and the two federal services.
I thought I was getting a raise.
Yeah, right.
Get forward.
Yeah, and so basically, when that time comes, there'll be a pot of money. It'll get divided equally as, per the board's discretion. The board might say, oh, we want the co-chairs to get, X% more just because they could have an extra workload of having to deal with me on a regular basis. And so that's in the mix, and that's for both you folk in here, other than the ones that said no to, and then the IRST will have that same opportunity. And so as you start to approach people and talk about, hey, you want to participate on this IRS team, you can say, here's a little extra carrot of some extra cash in your pocket. And that'll be, we'll talk about that, and I already talked on this.
When does that show up, and how does that, I mean, I'm assuming you don't have that right now in a pot somewhere, and that it's part of your policy option package?
Yes,
or
so
check
we've,
as well.
I was gonna hit that later on, but I'll touch on it now. We've put in a budget request, basically a $6 million ask, that for every 2 years, that's gonna cover staff at INR, that's gonna cover the participation grants, and that's gonna cover the research that gets commissioned, is the idea with that. So, you know, that hopefully will get approved, and we get that money in the end of, or beginning of July for the next biennium, and then it'll take some time to work through the nuts and bolts of that.
But we won't know, I'm asking this because it's gonna be well before that when we're approaching people about potential service on this IRST or independent research site.
Yeah, it's definitely something to, so, and I think we have a slide, we'll go into that a little bit more in depth of what that looks like, the budget. That's legislatively, approved. And so we'll know if we have the budget when they approve that part. My understanding, I'm new to Oregon, but my understanding is the forestry budget usually doesn't go through till June. So unfortunately, but, it's part of it that it's not, the $6 million isn't just to cover this part, it's for a lot of other things as well. And so for this to work, that has to go through. So it's a good chance it will. But, so, it's something that we can definitely, say it's going, we have to plan for it, that it will be approved. So.
In the meantime, there's an IOU in your packet.
Yeah, there's an IOU, and, so there it is. Like I said, it's legislatively approved. To be honest with you, as members of the executive branch, we can't say a lot about that.
And so also just timing wise, the board, the plan is to put this list of nominees before the board in June. They'd approve them, and, knock on wood, the budget for them would get approved. Will get approved, quote, the next day. That's the plan. And I guess if it weren't approved, who knows? Yeah, then you've got something else to figure out. Yeah.
And this participation grant goes over and above ending any funding for the actual research itself.
Yeah, this participation grant is for you folk, except for the ones I said too bad, Adam, Josh, Julie, and the IRS team members themselves. Yeah. That's the participation grant. But it's a separate thing than this big pot of money gets sold out into smaller pots. The biggest pot will be for the commissioned research, but it's still a separate pot that covers these team members.
I guess my concern is not necessarily that there won't be any money, but it's the amount. Right?
Yeah.
And that's what the legislative, that's what their conversations will be about.
Well, did you have
they'll settle on an amount. It might not be what they asked for.
Well, and in the POP narrative, did you have a specific allocation to the participant grant piece?
I don't think,
No, it was,
Like
it was
how it
pretty
might
broad.
be divvied up? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't recall it that being.
Because, I mean, I imagine the majority of that's gonna go towards the research, and then the second biggest pot probably to, contracting and administration with INR and stuff as well. So I'm just thinking about, okay, well, how much is actually gonna be left in that?
Right.
Because $6 million seems like a lot.
Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
So the amounts that were in the original, negotiated agreement, were, that per biennia, within that IRST bucket, there was envisioned that there might be support staff that would come. I've been anticipating, just thinking about the math on it all, depending on how many people were on the IRST, that it would be something like 30. I can say that, because I'm not OEM. But that's the ballpark that I have been expecting. Take that for what it's worth.
Yeah. And that comes back to also what Seth was saying, is we don't know how large that, we ask for X and will it be X minus something, or will it be X, we don't know. So I think the idea is, it ain't gonna cover someone full-time, but it's also not just, $5 to get you a cup of coffee. Okay.
$500.
Right. Let's move on to the next slide. So we did build in adaptive management to the adaptive management process. So we've got in-rule performance audits that we're going to hire out for, following the best standard practices. There's some federal yellow book or blue book or something that talks about those. But anyways, so those are every 6 years coming out to make, and that looks at the whole program, how everyone in this room is functioning, how the IRS team is functioning, INR, the whole thing together. So that is a accountability in a pretty significant way. And then annually we'll have to report to the board and the federal services on what's happening, progress report. So there's several measures of accountability built into this process. Okay, so let me take a moment here. So this is where we can get into the bones of how it actually will function. Let's hit the next slide. And so this is, right, initial conditions. So there's how things will function normally. There's a cycle and a whole thing that is the chart you saw earlier in Sean's presentation. Look at that next slide. Before those, let's go back. Sorry, good thing. We'll get to that. There's several things that need to happen before all that, which is you folks developing your team charter, creating an initial list of research topics, and part of your team charter is also electing co-chairs and nominating IRS team members. So this is sort of the summary of what we'll work on over the next several meetings. IRS team needs to also develop their team charter, and they need to have a determination of what best available science is. And that's, again, laid out in rules. So for them to say, these are sort of our standards of what best available science is, so that we know it when we see it, and we can make our, that is our guide for the work that we produce, so that everyone kind of understands that that threshold of what is best available science. So they will be determining that. Questions? Go ahead.
Clarification, so a few of these have that August 1st deadline, right?
Yeah.
Checking.
It's a long story, but it was supposed to have been later, and there was a snafu in the process, and this is all supposed to have been, the RC members is earlier, all this stuff is supposed to have been done by August 1st. Your folks' part, I think, is achievable. The IRS team won't meet that deadline, so we're figuring out Plan B.
That was the second part of my.
Right. And we're figuring that out.
Hence participation grants.
Right. Next slide, please. So this is where we get into actually how it all fits together. This is actually a visual of what's described in 0200 of the rules, but I'll walk folks through it. So we start off, you folks identify the research questions, set of questions that are important to you. And the board may weigh in as well. And, but it's really up to you to say, this is our policy question that we want the science to answer. Next. You send it on to IRST. They do a whole bunch of stuff to inform the next step, which we won't hit to yet, but they take your question and mold it into a question that's answerable in scientific terms, but they also say, hey, did we get this right? They come back to you, we put this in a way that we can answer scientifically. Did we still get the intent of what you want? And so there's an opportunity for back and forth there. They're also gonna do a light lit review to say, here's what's known and what's not known, and they're basically gonna do some pre-work that will inform both an RFP down the road as well as your decision. They're gonna say, okay, if you want this question answered with this level of rigor, it's gonna cost $300,000 and take us 2 years. Or if you want it at a much higher level, it could be $1 million in 5 years. And so they'll bring some of that type of stuff, that type of information that's detailed out in rule, and that'll come back to you. And then next, that's where you take all that and you say, oh, this is what all this means for these 3 or 4 research questions. And that'll take them some time, obviously, to pull that information. And actually, the first step is to even say, oh, to get you this answer meaning like a report that lays out statement of work, et cetera, budget, time. We need 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, even to get that to you. That goes back to you to say, okay, given the budget that we've got from the legislature, given what it will take to answer this question, the different levels of rigor, et cetera, certainty, we're going to decide this is our research agenda, send it on to the board for with a proposed budget, and the board will vote on that. Next. It goes back to the IRS team to implement, which means they put out RFPs, they get the proposals, they analyze them, they pick a winner, and I say IRT, and it's really them working very closely with INR on this. Managing the contract, looking at the deliverables, making sure the timeline, everything is being met in terms of the contract, et cetera. Producing the reports, both the technical report and layperson report that we talked about 10 minutes ago, producing all that body of work, and then next. They deliver it to you and the board simultaneously, both of those reports. Next. And that's where you folks take it and digest it, talk about it, figure out what, if anything, you want to do. You send it to the board. You say, hey, we think everything's good. We don't need any change based on this information. Or we think there should be a rule change based on this information. And that rule change could be stricter, less strict. And this is, again, where I think it's up in here. You can say, you know what, let's, and technically it can also happen down here. Let's get an economic analysis of what this means. It can also be, hey, board, there should be some other policy actions you should make here. So that's the set of decisions. Next. Or you might say, you know what, this is really great. This, you know, amphibians, where there seems to be, from my, I'm a layperson when it comes to amphibians, it seems like there's a lot of missing information. So there may just be even, like, what is the question? We need some preliminary research or look review to answer. What is the question that we need to address for amphibians? And by the way, we need to do another loop. So that's a possibility. So go ahead, Seth.
My question is, how much, so the Board of Forestry obviously has a huge interface with what we're doing.
Yes.
The board has other, for lack of a better word, we're almost like a subcommittee of the board.
You're a board advisory committee.
Yeah. And so, but the board has different sort of ways that they've operated with others. This is clearly much different than any other of the board subcommittees. And so my question really is, how much education has the board received on what we are and how we're supposed to interact with them? And then how do we create that so there's clear understanding between the board and us, and so that we can effectively work together and they understand and have trust in what we're trying to do, and we, you know, have a connection where we're not just, I don't want to spin my wheels here and have them then not really understand what we're doing and then just go a different direction. I think, and I don't think they want that either.
Right.
So,
Right.
how much interplay do we need to have there to set this up?
I think that's a great question. We haven't done tons with the board on this. I mean, obviously, we took the list of, I mean, there's all the rules that they ostensibly read and digested. We did a couple presentations to the board on what the data management program is, and I think it's going to be an ongoing conversation, education with them. We'll have annual reports that are status updates going to them, and none of us want the board to flounder when it comes to making decisions based on your information that comes from you folks.
I think it might be useful, and I'd be interested in other people's thoughts too as we get down the road, but it could be really useful to have like a subset of the board members come to one of our meetings as we get down the road and have a charter or whatever, for at least a part of that meeting, so we can have a discussion back and forth. It'd be great if like Jim Kelly could be there, with a couple other board members. We don't have to have them all, but these are public meetings, and so it should be fine to do that. And that might be really helpful outside of an actual board meeting, but maybe at one of our meetings.
I think that's a great idea.
And the board does have, I think they call them advisors or
Liaisons.
other committees.
Yeah.
They assign one of the board members to actually just.
Yeah.
By the way, this is Tim Hoffman. He's our
Sorry,
public,
thank you.
he's our public relations, with ODF, and he works with us on everything public relations. Reviews everything that we put out, so we don't say the wrong things, because, you know, I can't be trusted.
And I'm behind the scenes, workforce.
Yeah, thank
Know
you.
about a lot how they operate, just from you.
Yeah, that's a good point. So this is,
And, Terry, I wanted to just add to Seth's comments that it does, I think, thinking in terms of the charter too, and, I think it raises the conversation or the question of how, members of the Adaptive Management Program Committee communicate with the board too, and whether we have a process of doing that, or whether it's the co-chairs who do the communication on behalf of, I don't know, it just raised, since I've been on a lot of boards that are very public facing, it raised the question about whether we should decide that too.
yeah, that's a good point. And
But I think you're right that they do need to know.
yeah, I like that. And there's a couple of things that, within the rules, there's timelines for the board to go on the record of making a decision. So coming back to the earlier conversation about decisions in here, they're also, you know, we can't make them make a decision, but the intent all along was they need to go on the record with a vote that is, so we're gonna put things forward as a vote for them to go on the record with whatever decision is, rather than, well, we need more information, or let's not do anything, or we'll just, so that's not an option. We want them to, as well as you folks, as well as the IRS team, there are some timelines built into rule, and there are timelines that you folks will decide for yourselves about making decisions so that things move forward, continuously.
Yeah, I have just, two questions. So from what you said, Terry, it sounds like step 2 and 3, that can, like, that arrow is just pointing down, but it really should probably point both ways, in that there may be back and forth or an iterative process as the IRST thinks, okay, this is your question, we've developed this, like, how we think that it is, okay, now they go back to us, did we get it right? And we go back to them, oh, maybe not, and if there might be some iterative
Yes, yes.
nature there prior to us, like, I guess, really deciding this is the research agenda. So I just want to make sure that I captured that correct.
That's accurate, that's actually described in rule, there could have been a little bit better visualization of that.
Okay, and then second, so depending on how we formulate our questions and what they do, sometimes in order to answer a question, that we might have, there might need to be multiple different studies to answer that single question because it's multi-part, or you can't really get to the whole thing with the controls necessary for a scientific method, yada, yada, yada. And then, like, is there going to be opportunity for that where there's, multiple, research experiments and things that are going to answer one question, and then that gets wrapped into one report so that it's contextualized? Like, is there going to be that type of option, or is it really kind of like one question, one research, RFP?
Right, so we haven't dialed it all the way,
Yeah, and that's okay.
we haven't overly prescribed that aspect.
Yeah.
We wanted to put things, again, so much of the rules were an attempt to find that Goldilocks of enough detail to provide clarity, guidance, and guardrails, but not be overly prescriptive or overly complicated.
Yeah.
And so some of this, you folks will have the chance to shape as we move forward.
And hopefully some of that will be captured in that first green bullet, is that IRST draft, the statement of work. That statement of work might cover several different options, right?
Right.
It might say, hey, we could answer it this way, we could answer it this way, we could answer it that way, and with the budget behind each of those. And then if
to answer that question, we need to do this type of study, and this type of study, because that's a complex question.
Right.
Exactly. That's, and that's kind of, I think, what we're envisioning with this. So like you said, that it comes back to the decided research agenda, and you might be like, but does it? And and send it back. So that's always a possibility.
Yeah, or we get the statement of work back and say, okay, well, we had 3 questions, but 2 of them require 5 research, experiments apiece, so really we can only answer 1 question right now, or, like, I mean, is that sort of how we're thinking about this?
Yeah. And I think along the way, there's gonna be, we don't have it all, perfectly mapped out because we're practicing adaptive management here.
Yeah.
I love that cover. But there's certainly the opportunity to, as you folks are formulating a question, we can bring in, we could have a panel, for example, of 3 researchers that you can have a conversation with to help you think about the question, or, hey, this is the gap, or, this kind of stuff. So it's not like we need to do this completely in a siloed vacuum. It's, we're gonna respond by bringing in the information that will help you have these conversations, help you think about.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I mean, like the step 1, 2, and 3 almost is sort of this iterative process, right? Because they might do the lit review, and then we realize, oh, a lot of that has actually already been answered. Maybe we reformulate the question more specific to what we're actually trying to get at.
Yeah.
So anyway.
And so hopefully we can provide the support for you up front so that when you're formulating questions that go to the IRS team, the questions are already pretty good.
Somewhat informed. I like your idea, by the way, Terry, and I think about amphibians when it comes to that, right?
Yeah.
And like Adrian was saying, there's a lot of that that's kind of I don't know much about amphibians. I would love to have somebody come in, or a couple different folks at OSU or somewhere else come in and talk to us about what is known and what is the world of unknown when it comes to amphibians, before we even get into a discussion as a group about what are the questions we would have that would inform some of that, right? Yeah, I think that could be really useful. So it doesn't have to be just like the linear process. It could be, a little bit shaken up.
And I also want to bring up, and this is, of course, I think an unspoken thing with this, is that everyone at this table comes from different areas. And there's a very good point to that, is that you all bring something to this table, and you all have a voice at this table. And so when these questions are being posed, that's why that is like that. so that we have a really good representation of everyone in Oregon. And so I think that's a really super important part that I hope that we can, hit on more often as we move forward with this as well, to bring that out. So, because everyone represents a, constituency here.
Yep.
I have a question about the arrow that goes like this. Don't want to go there all the time, but, so I was thinking that you were saying that it goes to the Board of Forestry, that it'll be more like a vote rather than a process of them asking for more information and so on and so forth. Then I'm looking at that line. Could you say a little more about that bounce back up if need more information line?
Right, so ultimately, it's still gonna be a board vote that we need more decision. Now, I think the vision was that, as a general rule, the board is gonna very seriously, your folks' opinion, collective opinion on a matter is gonna have a lot of weight to what the board ultimately decides to do. Now, they may still say we need more info, even if you say, we think you should do X, they're gonna say, no, we need more info. So that's a possibility that we can't rule out, but at least they're going on the record of saying that. And that matters, rather than simply well, we'll talk about it another time. No, we've made a decision, the vote is to go get more information. So that's where we wanna help, support the board to make a decision of some form.
Sounds like you might have some PTSD there, Terry.
I was gonna pick it up on that too. So, in the interest of time, since we said we're gonna only go to like 3:20-ish, why don't we skip over to the timeline on this, so that, because I think that's important, that's one of the important pieces on this.
Yeah.
Like two
Thanks
up.
for handling all our questions, Terry.
Yeah, so keep rolling. So this timeline here. So, this is laid out, hopefully it makes some sense, and the yellow is where it's more information and conversation. The orange is, this is a draft document that's ready. So for discussion, and then a decision. And this is not set in stone. This is, I think, probably we can do it. Of course, I tend to be overly optimistic sometimes, but this is, so next time we'll start talking about the charter. The elements of the charter are described in rule, but we'll work through those elements, flesh those out, get everyone's thoughts and ideas about what those elements actually should look like. We'll go back and draft it, come back to you and say, what do you think? And you'll take red pens and mark it all up and talk about it some more, and then down the road, March, perhaps April, vote on it. How, electing co-chairs, actually, that should probably happen next time, but tricky because that's a substantial decision, and you need to decide what is a substantial decision, and that's a substantial decision to make. What is a substantial decision? Nominees, that's the biggest thing in terms of homework for next time, is starting to talk to folks about their participation on the independent research and science. I did do some preliminary numbers, so I did some estimates of what their work will look like, their workload. Had somebody review it, and so a maximum amount of work in a month is 12 to 14 hours on their part, probably. Give or take 20%. So any 50 hours, it ain't 2 hours. That's a maximum that they might hit occasionally. Probably more on an average, it's 4 to 6 hours a month. And then, and hopefully I'm not eating these, a year from now, and they're all like, what? But that gives you a ballpark of their time commitment, because all those folks are going to be busy with their regular day jobs, and this is participating on the IRS team, Better Research Sciences. It's going to take time, but it's also not. They're not going to have to miss, a week of work every month. It's going to take hopefully they can squeeze it in the rest of their busy lives. So that's, you know, the things to communicate. And next time we'll talk a bit about the characteristics of what you folks think would make a good independent research and science team member. So we'll talk a little bit more about that next time, but you can already start to talk with folks about, hey, would you be interested in this? And it's not, you're not asking for the commitment yet. Have them call me or email me if they have questions, and we can, you know, I could go through that chart. I can, there's a lot of things, a lot of details we didn't get into today that I can talk about with them. So if we need to have that list together and finalized for a June board decision, early June, but it really means like mid-April, we need to have that list on its way to the board. So we'll also get, next time we'll start to talk about the list of topics. There are 3 priorities outlined in rule, but we'll start to talk about that list of topics. And then several months down the road, start to talk about the first actual research questions that you want to send to the independent research science. So this is the timeline of your first set of work. We're right like minute before time, but I could stay over, but I also I want to respect people's time. Questions about this at this stage, knowing that a lot of this we'll talk more about next meeting, 2 meetings with that. Josh?
In terms of IRST nominees, is it all right if they're retired? So, for example, if we have a timber industry scientist who had a long career at Boise Cascade when they had a research group, or at Weyerhaeuser, which still has an excellent research group, but they retired, would they be eligible to serve as a timber industry representative if that's where they spent the majority of their career and retired from?
Yeah.
Or
yeah,
like we have folks from Inkazi, which is pulp and paper supported and have retired and so on.
Yeah, there's nothing preventing that. They need to be a subject matter expert, and they need to have an advanced degree in natural resources. Those are requirements. And the rest, we need to have a couple of buckets. We need to have a couple of groups represented that I talked about earlier. It's also in rule or statute. I mean, other questions about IRS?
Just to clarify.
Sure.
So I wasn't sure from your answer, so those buckets, you know, those 3 categories. So someone who is retired could qualify to satisfy one of those 3 categories?
Yes, and I would also defer to, I'm trying to think how to say this. I would, you know, there are folks that represent the timber industry here, for example, and, you know, I would hope that we would respect, you know, what they have to say about it. But ultimately, it's a decision that you folks vote on, on who the nominees are.
This is Lisa Gaines. Oops.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you. I just didn't know if anybody was able to see my hand raised. And I know that throughout the process, as INR is involved, we would love to be able to participate in your meetings, et cetera, so we know what's going on all the way. But in thinking about the nominations, is there going to be a process that this committee will put together so people can really officially apply to be a part or to have their name nominated? So for instance, we mentioned a couple of things when it comes to their expertise, the sectors they need to represent, but there might be a process where you might have somebody nominated, but everybody answers 1 or 2 of the same questions, or they're asked to submit a resume or something that might be transparent, because what I envision is down the road when the IRST is in place and INR in the housing role, the questions might come up about how are people chosen? What did that look like? So I'm just curious about what sort of process you all are thinking about to formally get names in, answering the same questions, and then ultimately be selected.
I think we need to look at their CV or something.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, and ultimately you folks get to make that decision, but you folks, meaning the National Program Committee, gets to make that decision. And next time we can talk about what parameters, what info you wanna have, but still start talking to people and putting it out there, and then you can decide on how you wanna, what parameters you wanna set for making the decision.
Might not be a significant decision.
Pretty sure it might be.
Yeah, Terry, I was just gonna ask, as far as nominating them to the board, do we have a number in mind that we're thinking as far as how many people?
It needs to be at least 5, and it needs to be an odd number. At the end of the day, it's your decision. I wouldn't do 21. That's too many. You know, generally,
A lot of scientists in one room.
Generally, groups, you know, it's good to have a diversity of opinions. You want folks that are gonna work well together. 13 is probably on the high side. On the other hand, 5, in my humble opinion, might be on the thin side, because then you get 1 or 2 people absent, and what about quorum, and how do they make, so, you know, there's something that.
Is there a list of special, fields that these folks should at least be knowledgeable in, for example, you know, more than just forest ecology, but hydrology, you know, soils, geotechnical engineering, whatever it is.
So that hasn't been, that's not specified exactly what those disciplines are, but it is natural resources, which covers fairly broad, but given that the biological goals and objectives are focused on these aquatic resources, should be ideally things that have a touch point with those biological goals and objectives. And there's measures where if there's expertise missing on that team, there's measures that they can go out and bring in that expertise to help formulate a research question. They can even commission that step 2 stuff. Step 2, where they're developing the sort of a draft proposal. They can commission that out to set of experts or a consultant or whomever to address that. So they don't have to have everything in the universe on that team, but they need to have enough breadth to think intelligently and go, oh, this is outside our scope, but we can hand this off to these experts to inform that.
I think the other thing to think about here too, Terry, is if they're serving on that team, on the IRST, can they, like, I'm thinking about there's several OSU researchers that would probably fit the bill great, right? But if they're serving on the team, could they then put in a proposal as well to do the research?
In rule, we thought about that, and yes, they can, they just have to recuse themselves from the decision-making process. So there's measures to try and address that, because, you know, there's some of these fields, there's a limited number of local experts, and so trying to balance that, we want that expertise overall on this, but we also don't want to exclude them from potentially informing that, and so.
And I would put this out there, since it's, we've got, draft for next month, I'm happy to have discussions, as a formal or informal subcommittee with everybody about, you know, not everybody all at once, or a majority even, of this group on, hey, who do you know that, you know, that OFIC would trust, that, like, I also have experience with, or whatever. So I'm available for that conversation.
Yeah,
And it's super fun talking to scientists, so I can be the really annoying, buggy one.
I like that idea. My only caution, and this is outside my wheelhouse, if this were the board, you need to be careful about what's called a serial
meeting.
Serial quorum, having those one-on-one that ends up being a quorum that's outside of the public.
Yeah.
So just to be wary of that, and I don't exactly know the answer to that.
I know all about that, that you probably do.
Yeah, so I don't know the parameters on that, but that's something to be.
I think definitely start thinking about the wish list and who needs to be on that team.
Yeah.
So, and does that wish list have 11 people on it? Does that wish list have 17 people on it, or whatever the number is, right? And like you said, that could be a forest ecologist, that might be a forest scientist, that might be a hydrologist, that might be, you know, that wish list.
Well, and Terry, since we don't have a charter, are you gonna be developing some best practices or protocols for us to score those nominees in order to get them, you know, that collated list to the board? Because I'm just thinking the timeline here, and if we're supposed to have a draft by February, but we don't have a charter until March.
No, I get it.
You know, I mean, it might be good thinking about, like Lisa said, about what information do we all need to be able to judge the other people that people are bringing forward that we may have no idea who they are. We don't know their background. We don't know their expertise. We haven't read their research. And then how do we take that information and then through a really transparent and fair way, score them or vote on them? You know, scoring may be better, right? Or I don't know, but to determine what that list is of 7 or 9 or 11 or whatever we decide.
It might not be that difficult.
It might not, I might be overcomplicating it, but.
Is the world of people willing to do this work might not be.
And that could be the case.
Yeah, we might be like, woohoo, 7. We might be like 3, 5. We got the minimum.
That's a good point. We might celebrate when we have the minimum.
Yeah.
But I think you're right that, like, you had mentioned a CV, like, I think that if we're bringing forward a name, if I'm like, hey, this is a person that I'd love to have cover that conservation, that we have, you know, whether it's a CV or resume and a list of research papers that they've published, that we can present here.
Are we gonna have,
That's all right. I was gonna say, in addition to a CV, it might be nice to have a short statement by whoever's nominating them about why they think they would be a good person on the board.
I was just gonna say, it might, and this might be what you're intending to tee up for the next meeting, Terry, but it might be good to have a discussion as a group about the characteristics, because there's a difference between somebody that's got their head down in research, like they're doing their research and they've just got, versus somebody that's, is served on some research boards and committees and is used to like evaluating other proposals. Like those are two different types of skills.
Yeah.
I think we want to be looking at soft skills as well as sort of, the technical background. To make this work.
That was, in my dream world, we were gonna be talking about that as a group, those characteristics and parameters, and we didn't quite get there today. So, that is, those are important things.
Well, and to that end, I mean, INR is really good at developing requests for proposals and things like that. Is INR planning on doing any of that work in your capacity? I guess I'm looking over at Sean.
So when you say request for proposals, you mean once the IRC is in place, or do you mean?
Yeah, once the IRC is in place, like Seth was saying, some of those soft skills or having some of those other skills, but is any of that work planned to be done by INR?
May I answer? So,
Go ahead.
I don't know who was speaking. May I ask who was speaking?
Yeah, it's Amanda Sullivan Astor with Associated Oregon Loggers.
Hello, Amanda. Thank you for the question. When it comes to helping to develop the RFPs, and that will be based on the work of the IRST, yes, we will take that role. When it comes to, and I don't know if your question was asking, if it comes to sort of developing the request and the helping to develop the criteria for you all to nominate and for people to apply to be on the IRST, that is not within our statutory mandate that is written for us to do. However, I would be more than happy to supply Terry some of the information that we used, for instance, when we helped the Oregon Global Warming Commission select the advisory committee for the Natural and Working Lands Group, or when we helped the state develop criteria for selecting the task force members for Senate Bill 202 in 2015 and others. So we'd happily supply that stuff for you all to do. And if you want us to have a role, we can help out with that.
Thanks, Lisa.
You bet.
I think more information is better. So, thank you, Lisa. So we're past time. I know I'm having fun. I also want to respect people's time. So, any last, so
Terry, could you bring next month, or send out just before next month, some draft charters, or if you got a charter samples, could you send something to us that we could look at and use that as a beginning point to start the conversation with? And then the housing agencies for the IRST, I mean, and talk about that a little bit too.
Right, so, well, how about we talk more about that next time? The short story is INR is gonna be the staff supporting them. That's the short story. And there's a lot of detail that we're even figuring out still and conversing with INR about. But there is some detail that is actually in the rule that the initial welcome letter that Nick Henneman sent you folks has a link to the rules, and it's like maybe you have a printed copy there, but it's Old 450 talks about the first housing agency rules.
And in the, in your packets, in the 2 slides that we're gonna skip over, there is an AMPC charter outline.
Yeah.
That it goes over, slides 38 and 39, kind of towards the end there. Kind of has in some, to start getting you thinking for next time of what things need to be answered, what questions need to be answered. For that, but Terry can send that out as well.
Yeah.
For more. The thing we do need to talk about this time is the, I think it's like one of the last lines, Jacob, could you skip to like, I think it's like 40? It's that wrap-up slide.
Oh, yeah.
One more. Right there. We do need to talk about, if we're going to do, next meeting, and if it's gonna be all virtual, or do you wanna have some in person, or what would you like to do with that?
I think especially in this early part, as we're building relationships, it'd be really helpful to be in person as much as we can. You know, with the option for remote if it's not possible or feasible.
I agree.
Concur totally. Yep.
First decision.
It wasn't substantial.
That was consensus.
We're on it.
Okay.
See, it's already working, Mia.
They're all gonna be like.
Drop the mic.
Right.
Right.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks,
So I think, other than that, you'll be creating the charter.
Yeah, next time.
Let the co-chair develop initial list of topics, okay?
Great.
Cool. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I reached out to, no, it's really helpful.
Right.